Hello, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us in this new thrilling FTB Lunch and Learn series, in which we will guide you on an expedition through life at Wood. We'll be showcasing a new profession every month and providing you with a comprehensive glimpse into their daily routine, from sunrise to sunset, their contributions, and the distinct duties and obligations they bear. This type of content is exactly what y'all all been asking for, and we hope to inspire you to take a role in energy. And today I am beyond elated to introduce our guest. We have Catherine Zimmerman. She is the Decarbonization Director at Wood for the Americas. She joined Wood as an intern in 2006 and has been with the company ever since. Starting out as an intern, then moving into engineering, business development, project management, and recently getting appointed to her new role as a decarbonization, that is a tricky word, Catherine, director. With companies around the world setting decarbonization and net zero goals, Catherine's role has become everly increasingly important in the energy space. Katie, as I can say it in short, thank you so much for joining. And I have to say, I am just so excited to jump into not just your role, but you as a person and your experience at Wood. So thank you so much for coming on today.
And thank you for having me. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Well, let's just get started because I'm sure everybody's aware not only what is this role in Wood, but what kind of aspects you need in order to be in decarbonization. And where did you get your start? So what's your educational background? What did you pick in school? And alternatively, what made you choose this career at Wood?
Those are all very good questions. So first and foremost, I'll say I'm an oil and gas kid from Houston. So my parents moved here for an assignment in the early 80s that was supposed to be like a 2-year assignment. And they joke that it's been the longest 2-year assignment of their lives. They've never left. So I grew up in Houston. Both of my parents are engineers. So that was always something that I saw growing up, was my parents were working on pipeline projects in particular. So I was always pretty good at math and science. I always thought it was interesting. It was okay, but I really liked English and history and art history and government. So I really struggled with what do I want to do when I grow up. I didn't want to do exactly what my parents did. I'm one of those difficult people that wanted to do my own thing. So I kind of looked at, do I want to do genetics, economics? Do I want to do law or become a doctor? But the nice thing about engineering is you can do lots of things with it. So I even looked at my parents' careers. My dad went more of like a corporate route where he still did lots of engineering, but he was able to do business development type activities. And then my mom had gone her own way. And instead of just like designing pipelines, she wrote a program that could map pipelines. And so I saw that there was a lot of potential for you can have an engineering degree and not do engineering. So I thought, worst case scenario, I'll get a degree and I'll pick a really broad type of engineering so that I can do whatever I want to do when I really figure out what it is that I want to do with my life.
I really like that piece of advice that you gave because you're so right. Sometimes when you work for just one company, one operator, you're just solving that operator's problem where you're solving everyone's problem, which really goes into, what kind of roles did you take at Wood before becoming the decarbonization director that you think helped you get into this role as far as from a skill set perspective? Is there anything that you did that you think helped you manage where you're at today?
I think that everything that I did in some way, shape, or form gave me a skill set that I use now. And it's not necessarily the obvious ones all the time. But right out of school, I worked on a big offshore project where we were making topsides for a platform off of Angola. And that was very process intense. So I was making piping and instrumentation diagrams. And for people that don't know what that is, it's kind of where you're drawing out how do you turn the goop that comes out of the ground from the well into oil and gas that you can sell, and then get the water out of the process as well. And then how do you make all of these products meet the pipeline spec? So for that, you have to use separators, compressors, pumps, a lot of really cool equipment and you have to use control valves, but you start seeing that there are certain basics that we have in engineering, like the pressure and the temperature matter. So if you put the same fluid in at a different pressure or temperature, it's going to act a different way, right? Sometimes vapor, sometimes liquid. And you start seeing some of these very basic concepts a bit more intimately. And that ends up playing into a lot of the work that I did later when I moved into shale. So we had an opportunity basically to get into shale before everyone else did. And we kind of looked at, well, what skill sets do we have? And we thought, we know how to do modularization from offshore. We know how processes work really well, and we're used to having surprises all the time and adapting. And shale was that on a whole other level. But you kind of could take some of your skill sets that you had from offshore and use them for shale. And then we figured out, like, how do I do it cheaper, faster, smarter? And really that design one, build many concept that we all talk about so much in offshore and shale, you see it and it happens, and you see a facility that you designed one of, and you kind of have it really like an assembly line where it just goes out the door, and you have Lego blocks that you order. And then when you get out to the field, you put the Lego blocks together, right? So for shale, it was really exciting for me because when you do big offshore jobs, you spend years on a project. I spent 3 years on one Gulf of Mexico platform project, just doing like P&IDs, and then you do a bunch of other deliverables and simulations off of that. But then you go to shale, and it's in a much smaller window of time. It's like you've designed the facilities, you've procured everything, you've constructed it, you've built it, operators have been operating it, they've called and yelled at you to say you didn't do something right, you figured out how to do the design better, you've redone it. And so you got very different skill sets doing like the shale jobs versus the big fancy offshore jobs where you had to have a lot of time to think it through, because if you're offshore and something goes wrong, you can't really react the same way as you can if it's onshore, and you can just order a new part. It's not a big deal. And then with that, I really got interested in brownfield. I like a bit of the creative side of engineering. I know a lot of people probably feel like engineering is very much like sit in your cubicle and you crunch the numbers, but there's a lot of creativity that you can put in there as well. So it was, how do we do this smarter, better, faster, like I said. But then you have certain sites where with shale, you don't always know what's the well going to give you. And you think you know, so you do a design based on what you expect. And what you expect isn't always what you get. So we did a lot of brownfield modifications. And then as you wanted to increase throughput, because everybody figured out, oh my gosh, the Permian has a ton of oil and gas. So we try to crank more through these facilities, and you'd have to do debottlenecking, but you'd be trying to think like, okay, how can I do this the fastest way possible? So where this all kind of comes in later is I went from, I don't want to just do these individual itty bitty projects anymore. I wanted to look at the big picture. So when you go to look at the big picture, you can often see patterns across different assets. And one of the patterns that we started seeing with brownfield onshore and offshore was clients were looking at, how do I keep my compressors online? And one thing I was seeing with fuel gas calcs and a bunch of other things is every time a compressor stops and has to restart, you use way more fuel gas on that than you do if you just keep the compressor running happily the whole time. And then you'd see a lot of flare mitigation. So it makes sense that operators want to keep the hydrocarbons that we're making money off of in the pipe. So nobody really wants to flare. So we were already doing a lot of projects where you're doing flare mitigation, and you're trying to figure out, like, what's a better way to do my processes? What's a better way to make my facility have a longer life? And these are all things that we started kind of saying, wait, there's a sustainability angle here, because all these process optimizations that we're doing, like when you go and you switch out all your pneumatic valves to have electric controllers, all of those things. And when we started saying, I don't really want like a thief hatch that's popping all the time on my tanks, these are all sustainability sort of projects as well. And so when you turn your or your perspective, I guess is the best way to say it, and you start viewing it as it's not just my job as business as usual to increase throughput, we're actually achieving all these other goals as well.
Mm-hmm.
And so then I had already started approaching some of my projects as sustainability projects. And then Wood had an energy transition position open. I think that was 3 years ago. And I was coming back from maternity leave one time. And so my boss knew I was very interested. And she said, would you be interested in going out for this energy transition role? And it was in a totally different part of Wood, but I'd dealt with them before. So they were familiar with me, but I'd never worked in that group. And luckily, they took a chance on me, and the rest is history. So.
I love it. I love the way that you walked us through that. And I want to go back to when you're talking about projects, because when it comes to like traditional upstream, downstream projects, a lot of the operators kind of know what they want, and then you're defining it along the way. And when it comes to decarbonization, it's a different thing. Like, yes, we had been doing things in the past and we had maybe bucketed in this realm, but now it's like an active thing that we're all working on. How has that aspect been different working on direct decarbonization projects, as far as like the collaboration between you and the operators and your customers?
Right. So I want to kind of draw a similarity to shale, which probably seems a little interesting. But when we first started doing shale projects, people didn't really know how it should look or what was the best answer. So it was much more collaborative and let's figure this out together. And the similarity is when you get into these decarb projects, there are so many different things that you can look at. If you have like a downstream asset, everyone's hearing about hydrogen fuel switching, hear about carbon capture, you'll hear about premium products being made and biofuels, electrification. There are just so many options out there. And a lot of people who have experience in oil and gas, if we go to a traditional oil and gas project, we all know exactly what to do. If you want to bring a well online, we feel like we've got this. I don't need anybody's help. And it became kind of a race to the bottom for service providers on how cheaply and how efficiently can you do everything. And where that's still a focus is obviously there's a lot of emphasis on how can you do this job as quickly and as cheaply as possible. That's always a driver. But for decarbonization, there's a lot more freedom if there's not a prescriptive answer yet. So like at Wood, we kind of came up with a methodology of how we look at everything in dealing with our clients. So because we're a bunch of engineers, it's an acronym.
Of course.
Yeah, of course. It's the SCORE methodology, and you can kind of score yourself at the end of it. But we look at opportunities for substitution. So that's where you have like your hydrogen fuel switching. You can have electrification from renewables in there. You can have biofuels. So you can swap out like either the fuel of what's powering it or feedstock to try to reduce the carbon intensity. And then we have C, that's for carbon capture. It's pretty obvious. So there are a lot of times where CO2 comes from the process of whatever we're doing. So you can't just do a fuel switch or electrification and have all the emissions go away. So for those hard to abate sectors, as we often bucket them, you need to have carbon capture. And we have world-class experts that are amazing to work with on that. But so they can look at it and say, like, for this application and the plot space that you have, this is probably your best option. And then when you get to O, that's offset. And I'll admit, I'm an engineer, and that seems like cheating to me. I guess in certain groups, that's the way that they have to do it to get their emissions down. But for me, it's like I typically skip right over that and go to R because that's reduced. And that's where traditional oil and gas people naturally thrive, because that's how do I reduce emissions of what I'm already doing. So that's what we talked about earlier with how do I keep my compressor online? How do I optimize the process? How do I mitigate flaring? That's the topic area that falls under. And then E is evaluate. It's like we weigh all of those. And really, you have to look at how expensive are all of these options, and then what does it actually achieve for what you're trying to do. And that's where firms like Wood, we can go in and we can do the consulting and the engineering to get you like a levelized cost of abatement and help you plan like, this is how much money you have to spend. So here's where we recommend you spend it. And then here's how you go about doing that. Because a lot of these projects, like sometimes for carbon capture, for example, certain applications, I've seen projects where the estimated capex like $1 billion, right?
Yeah.
And the plot plan can be as big as the facility that you're putting the carbon capture on.
Wow.
So carbon capture is not always the answer, but there are applications where it definitely is the answer. And in areas like the Gulf Coast, where you have amazing pore space that you can inject the CO2, the economics might be more in your favor than like if you have a project somewhere where the pore space isn't as good. So that's where there's a lot of engineering that's really exciting and fun that comes in with decarbonization. And it does remind me of shale because obviously like I started with wood in 2006. I don't have a ton of decades of experience here, but I kind of said like with shale really early on, not a lot of people had experience. So it was a good time for me to go into shale because one of my coworkers told me once, he famously said, if you look around the room and no one else knows more than you, you're the expert. And with decarbonization right now, you can have this technical background. And even like we have a lot of people that have a policy background. Like there's a guy who's a lawyer on our team. And then you have people that have marketing and communications backgrounds where they're looking at how do I communicate what carbon capture and sequestration is to the public,
Yes.
and how do I make it in terms that people who aren't engineers understand. So it's a really great, exciting time for people to look at what are my skill sets and then how can I apply them to decarbonization projects. And no one is really, saying that they've been doing all of these projects exactly as they're planned for forever. There aren't enough hydrogen experts to go around. There aren't enough carbon capture experts. There aren't enough biofuels experts. I could go on and on and on. There's a lot of opportunity for people to come in and say, this is something that interests me, and this is what skill sets I have that are relevant.
I really like that you touched on other aspects of the skill set besides engineering, because we have talked a lot about engineering, but I was actually going to ask you, can somebody do it who just has a marketing background or communications background, or maybe doesn't have the technical experience? What other roles in decarbonization can they have, and have that be at Wood or even some of the companies that you work with?
Yeah, so a lot of the people for what I do have a technical background because they're coming in and they're looking at how can I modify what's there, or how can I build something new to make it net zero or to get, reduced carbon intensity. But like I alluded to, we have like an amazing policy team. And a lot of that is what's making a lot of these projects go so quickly right now is a lot of government funding. And so I'm an engineer. I can read things and say what I think they mean, but I'm not a policy expert, right? So if you have people that go through policy documents and they understand the wider landscape and they have a law background, they're much better at that than I am. And then they can say, oh, this is similar to, and then direct you somewhere else as well. And then, like I said, we have marketing and communication. I joke like with things like SCORE, and I have a few other funny things that I've come up with, like hashtag H2 town for Houston, hashtag little c big US. And I joke Marcoms is going to fire me. but we have a team of people where it's like they're actually really good at marketing communications, like you heard from Carrie.
Yes.
So there are a lot of different skill sets, and not everybody's an engineer either. There are a lot of people that are like physicists or they're math majors, and they can do all sorts of stuff around like digital dispersion calculations. There are all sorts of different aspects that all feed in to decarbonization. And there's a lot around like modeling of CO2 and hydrogen and pipelines, dispersion calcs, like I said, of what do they do when they get out of the pipe. And then there's a lot around construction for a lot of these projects coming up. But yes, there are so many different types of roles, and like accounting, I see that being a big thing as everybody's trying to figure out how do I account for my emissions. And then when you go to try to do these tax incentives, what can you take credit for? What can't you take credit for? How do you do Greek modeling?
Yeah.
Coursera, like there are all these things we
So
could
many
start
different
throwing out.
opportunities.
Yeah, and that's where I just want everyone to understand, like there are so many opportunities, and with the types of problems that we're seeing, they're not problems that we've seen quite at this scale and this amount of opportunity before. So we need to get creative with how we solve these problems and get big collaborative groups and not have everyone approaching it with the exact same lens over and over again. We need to be sure that we really think things through and approach things from different angles.
You did
Right.
mention about global. So what's your day like as far as when it comes to like, do you work from home? And do you have like different hours due to the global calls that you have? Can you walk us through that a little bit?
Yeah, so because our headquarters are in the UK and my boss sits in the UK, we typically will have like an earlier start at Wood out of the Houston team. So in general, most people try to be online by 7:30 or 8. I will often have calls with the UK, or if I'm trying to catch people where you're trying to hit 7. And for me, it works out really well because if we wanted to talk about what does my morning really look like,
Yes. Might I add, your dual career with, I believe, 4 kids, if I'm recalling
yes,
correctly. So, yeah,
yes.
I would love for you to additionally kind of just give us a glimpse into that life of yours, because I think also what's really incredible about your journey and then your role at Wood is that you are a working dual career family and you have made it successful for y'all. And so I think sharing any advice that you can during this as well is very needed and would be very appreciated.
Yeah, so first I'm going to just say rule number one, and I work really hard on this personally, is I say give yourself grace. That's rule number one. But honestly, for me, it's like I joke I don't need an alarm clock. I have 2 kids that are pretty little still. They're like one's under 2, one's 3, and then I have a 9-year-old and an 11-year-old. So I'm typically up before 6, no alarm clock needed. And it works out really well, actually, for me for Wood having the earlier start because my kids' school, they actually are supposed to be starting about 7:20 for the older 2. So we try to have everybody out the door by 7.
Mm-hmm.
It's a goal. We try. Um, but a lot of the times, then what it ends up being is my husband does drop off, so I can be on calls. And if I do have the calls that start on 7, I don't tell myself you have to take that first call in the office. Now, sometimes if you have a bunch of calls throughout the day where you know you have to be in the office for an in-person meeting at 10, sometimes you just have to move things around and make it happen. But a lot of times I can take like the first batch of calls at home because I'll have a lot of coordination calls with, okay, what's my teammate doing in the
Mm-hmm.
UK? And then it's, oh, I want to talk to that team that did a really cool CO2 transport paper, and I want to get the UK person and the people out of Canada and the people out of Houston. So those sorts of things where I need input from across the pond, I'll try to make those earlier in the morning. And then later in the morning, I try to do those like in-person client meetings if you can, where you're getting a little bit of breathing room to
Mm-hmm.
where you're not trying to do that for 8 and trying to get everything else achieved. It doesn't always work out that way, but I do try to make sure too that when I get into the afternoon, I have a little bit of breathing room, because I think what always happens is if you overbook your schedule, I think we all learned this during COVID, you
Yeah.
can be in calls straight from like 7 to 5 with
Mm-hmm.
no breaks. So I have tried to create some of those blocks where then if I'm going through the day and I find an issue in the morning that I say, oh, I really need to look into that more, then I can put it on the docket for the afternoon in that blanker space. Um, but a lot of times, like my job is mostly coordination and problem solving with bigger groups, and then trying to get everybody moving in the same direction. So it's a lot of alignment and checking in with people and seeing like, okay, if this proposal is super strategic and we think that it's very important, or one phrase that I like to use a lot is high grading the portfolio. So instead of trying to chase after every single opportunity where somebody can say it's renewables, it's decarb, try to look at it and say, why are we uniquely positioned to do this project? And what is our unique value proposition for the client? And making sure that that gets into proposals. So if I let myself get too bogged down by everything, like I said, then you can't really move the needle. So try to leave some afternoon time for moving the needle. And then typically in the afternoons on times where my husband has to go into the office and he often has his more important meetings at the end of the day, then I'll try to get to pick up. But then the understanding is we typically have it pretty well figured out on, okay, if we get to a point where you're trying to cook dinner from scratch on a weeknight and you're just running, everything's going to break down. So you try to do a lot of meal prep in advance. Having 4 kids has made me have to be a lot more organized. And I identify critical path. I joke that it's like project management crash course. But then also like one thing that I typically say, it's free advice. It's worth the price you paid. But my husband and I did a lot of work on identifying what those pain points were in our schedule. And so things like, we know if we're trying to do a ton of meal prep during the week and make something fancy, the wheels are going to fall off the bus. So you figure out some of those things like salmon. You can get a salmon and you can sprinkle stuff on top, throw it in the oven, and you feel like a great parent because it's healthy, but you put no effort into it. So things like that we figured out. And I will admit, I have finally cracked and gotten some extra help on things around my house where it was like laundry. Laundry was driving me nuts and I could have clean clothes all day long, but finding the time to like fold and put away and keep everything organized. And then when kids switch sizes, going through and fixing that, really trying to make sure, because we do have 2 working parents. And then if a kid gets sent home sick from school or something like that, you just don't need any extra added stress in life. So we've tried to go through and say, what are the nice to haves and what are the needs, and address all the needs, and then figure out how to get rid of the pain points. So yes, it's busy.
I love it. It's just so inspirational in a role like yours, and both of y'all doing what you're doing, and Wood supporting you along the way. It's very incredible to see. It's just so incredible to see the culture, and we saw it also in Carrie's episode as well. And it's throughout the whole entire company. So to end, I really wanted to ask you about, how do you see your role evolving in the future, both for Wood and the companies that you support?
So one thing I'm super excited about, and this is why I wanted to do the role of Decarbonization Director for the Americas. If you look at places like Calgary, like Houston, like if you go to New Orleans, even Aberdeen, you have those cities and those areas that are so fossil fuel based for our histories, and we've made amazing industries around those. And now when you look at what does the world need? The world needs clean, affordable, secure energy. And I think that a lot of our current powerhouses for oil and gas expertise are the ones that are going to bring a lot of these clean energy solutions. And so looking at, for companies like Wood, for companies like, Shell, BP, Exxon, Chevron, all the traditional oil and gas companies, is how do you take the skill sets that you have and really pivot them to meet all of those goals in a new, better way. And there are a bunch of projects and pushes that they have right now, like for Houston. We're looking at carbon capture, and we have a project right now that was along the Houston Ship Channel at the Shell Deer Park Chemical Complex. And it was a U.S. Department of Energy grant that Wood got. And when we started looking at why do we want to chase these projects, it was partly that you see Houston in particular has such a rich history in petrochemicals, refining, but with that, we have a lot of emissions. right? Same with Louisiana. And you see that again, I mentioned Alberta. You see that with industrial clusters in the UK. But for the UK, if you get all of the planned projects that the UK government has for carbon capture, by 2040, they're going to capture 40 million metric tons of CO2 if everything goes to plan. Houston, the publicly kind of spouted number by Exxon is they want a Houston hub that is 100 million metric tons per annum by 2040. So Houston alone, 2.5 times all of the UK, right? And then we see other projects that our clients are working on that are just as big or bigger in the US and in Canada. So if you start seeing the scale of these projects, if you're a projects person, if you're a problem solver, there are so many cool, exciting projects just on the horizon. And a lot of them will happen in the energy capital of the world, Houston, or they'll happen, over in Aberdeen, the energy capital of Europe, Calgary. So a lot of these places where we have oil and gas expertise that we can pivot and use. And so that's where I'm passionate about. People from oil and gas need to get into these energy transition projects.
There's so much opportunity, and you have outlined so much incredible aspects of the role and everything that you're working on and the companies that you support. The customers that Wood supports and yourself. And I just think that this is just an incredible space for people to get into. Have you already been in oil and gas and maybe you're looking to transition, or maybe you're a new grad and you're looking at, how can I make an impact in the world? And decarbonization is the place to be. Houston's a great spot, but you also additionally talked about areas around the globe that you can also find opportunities in. So I think it's incredible, and I'm so happy that I'm also in this space. And so I see the passion in you, and I feel the same way. So thank you so much for sharing and being so vulnerable. And it's been incredible to hear about your story with Wood and how Wood has supported you.
Well, thanks for having me. It's been great.
And we hope that you like this. Please stay tuned. We'll be releasing one every month, a Lunch and Learn with Wood, and we hope to catch you at the next one. Thanks, Katie.